Quite a few of our guests here, and I will begin. Some people might be joining us in just a minute, but first of all, I would like to thank you all for joining us today for our second virtual Lunch and Learn. My name is Joy Alice Eisenhower. I'm the Director of Arts and Culture for the Boulder JCC, and we have a really wonderful presentation for you today. But before we begin, I'd like to orientate you just a little bit to our first webinar. Many of you might have already noticed, many of you might have joined us already for a Zoom meeting, and you might have noticed that this is a little bit different of a format. First of all, in a webinar, you can just sit back and relax because you will not be on camera today, nor will you have to worry about muting or unmuting yourself. Instead, we will just be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask questions at any point during the lecture. And then David, our speaker today, will try and answer as many of the questions as possible at the end of his presentation. But if you have any technical concerns, you can also ask for help on the Q&A, and our coordinator, Jody, will be answering you directly. I just also want to give you a little forewarning that we'll be ending this webinar promptly at 1:15. So thank you again so much for joining us today. We're grateful for you all to be here virtually. And now let's welcome David Ilan, the director of Nelson Gulick School of Biblical Archaeology at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, where he specializes in mortuary archaeology, religion, and ritual. Since 2005, he has directed the excavations at Tel Dan in North Israel, and fortunately for us, he is a visiting professor at CU Center for Study of Origins. We are delighted to have you here today. Thank you, David.
Thank you. So we will try to inaugurate this from an archaeological point of view, doing a lecture on a webinar series. You should stay tuned because there probably will be a couple more of these in the coming weeks. Hopefully it'll be a format that we can really work with. Okay, I'd also like to reiterate and thank the Boulder Jewish Community Center for making this happen. And I'd once again like to thank the Center for the Study of Origins at the University of Colorado for hosting me this year. It's been, how shall I say, quite a ride. Okay, so let's get on with it. The framework for today, we're going to be talking about the moon and the moon god and apparitions of the moon god and how that functions. So what I'll do first is I will do sort of a survey of archaeological contexts in Israel and around the area all around. And then we'll look at earliest appearances of the crescent and the moon. We'll look at things from the metal point of view. Then we'll transition over to stone objects. And then we'll look at place names a little bit. We'll then touch on texts just a little bit. And then we'll talk about the crescent moon as a symbol in action. What does a symbol do, especially when it's jewelry? This started as an academic talk several years ago, and here are some of the references. I won't go into them right now. A few have been added since then, but for later reference, you can look at these as well. So this whole research started with my work at Tel Dan, preparing the early Iron Age material for publication. The publication is coming out right now as we speak. It's at the printers. At Tel Dan, one of the interesting things about this period is this is when the Egyptian empire has collapsed, and all the empires in the Eastern Mediterranean have collapsed. And this is a period when new political entities, new ethnicities are coalescing. It's a very interesting, very turmoil period in history. And one of the aspects of this turmoil and this chaos is the fact that metals were not really that accessible, and people were going into tombs and ancient temples and robbing them, plundering them out, scavenging metal to be recycled. And in one of these areas where metal was being recycled, I came across this object, this crescent-shaped object made out of bronze. And I asked myself, as archaeologists do, what does this look like? Are there any parallels for this in other assemblages? And I started looking. And as I was looking, I came across all kinds of interesting things. I really went down the rabbit hole. And so you're going to now see the results of that inquiry. What does this thing mean, this crescent? Well, to begin with, anybody who knows anything about ancient religion knows that the moon and its crescent form especially were connected to the moon god, the moon deity, who was in most polytheistic societies a very important god. The moon god is very often associated with a bull. And you can see these massive horns from this African bull having the shape of a crescent. And these two things were seen as connected. And the bull became one of the primary symbols of the lunar deity wherever you go, but especially in the ancient Near East. So let's look at the crescent in archaeological contexts from prehistory. Perhaps the earliest manifestation that we know of is this famous carved stone that's called the Venus of Losel, and you can see why she's called Venus. Obviously, her fecundity, her fertility aspect is being emphasized. There are those that would suggest she is the Earth Mother Goddess, and she's holding in her hand a horn. It might be the earliest manifestation of the cornucopia. And she's holding this horn, and the question is, what does that horn mean? It may be that the horn is an aspect of maleness. Perhaps it's somewhat phallic, or not. We can only speculate, but this is the earliest manifestation that I came across. Closer to home in Israel, in the Judean desert, in a cave, a hoard or treasure was found high up above the desert in a very inaccessible place. And part of this hoard of metal objects and other things were these ivory standards that are made of hippo ivory. And these were called standards because they were apparently mounted on the hole in the middle. And they're perforated with these rows of holes. It's not quite clear what this means. It's not clear at all. Different people could suggest different things. I think that maybe we're looking at an agricultural motif. Perhaps we're looking at the holes made by digging sticks in primitive agriculture. This is probably before the plow was adopted. It's just about this time that it was adopted. So maybe there's something agricultural going on here. And I would suggest that the shape of the hippo horn is probably referencing the crescent moon. There are similar things later on in ancient Egypt. These are often called ivory wands. Here's an example from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. You can find this online. These are called wands. They're usually found in burial contexts, and they are thought to be protective items that protect the dead who are supposed to be reborn later on, and protect infants just after childbirth from evil spirits. Note that the creatures and the deities that are portrayed in the wand all hold daggers or knives to protect whoever they're supposed to protect. I would suggest that perhaps this is also hippo ivory. I would suggest that this too may be referencing the moon and the moon god. Again, closer to home and back to the Chalcolithic period, circa 4200 BCE, is the famous Star of Gasul. Gasul is a Chalcolithic site located in the Jordan Valley, just north of the Dead Sea, with a whole village set up. And in one of the houses of this village was found this mural, a beautiful polychrome mural that has as its centerpiece what looks like the sun, perhaps, or a star. We're not quite clear what it is, but what I want to look at, and I want you to look at, is this thing right here. See the crescent moon? And around it, probably constellations. And this might be one of the earliest clear depictions of constellations on Earth. Note, by the way, that this enclosed symbol is touching another item right over here, which different people have suggested is different things. I think we're looking at a hippo with its mouth open, displaying its canines, its teeth, from which we get the ivory. That's my take on it. You can accept that or not. Okay, now let's look at the crescent in metal. Here is a hoard from Kfar Monash, dates to about 3100 BC. This contains local metals, but it also contains several Egyptian-typed objects, like the knife here on the left. We don't know how this ended up in the fields of Kfar Monash. It wasn't in an archaeological site. It seems to be a sort of hoard. We could make up a story about what this is doing here. Maybe there's a caravan of Egyptians carrying metals and supplies to the Egyptian garrison at Tel Megiddo that got waylaid along the way, and they quickly hid away the treasure and never survived to get it back. In any case, that's just a story. But what I want to look at here is this object, which is clearly crescent-shaped. It also has no obvious function except as a symbol, a bright, shiny copper crescent. We'll come back and see that in the future in just a bit. A little bit later in time, in the circa 1500 BC, the site of Tel El Ajul, which is located today in the Gaza Strip, excavated in the early 20th century. This was a site where Canaanites lived, and probably Canaanites or Semites in any case, who were running away from Egypt after the Egyptians had taken their capital at a place called Avaris in the Delta, the Egyptian Delta. They had run away and come back to this place called Tel El Ajul, a Canaanite tell. And this place was besieged by the Egyptians. And during the siege, apparently the local inhabitants and the refugees socked away hordes of gold and silver jewelry in the walls of houses and under the floors. There were several of these. This is one sampling of jewelry from those. And note that the crescent is quite prevalent here. Here's an earring or a pendant, which is clearly in the crescent form, very shiny gold jewelry. Here's another one. This is usually called a wesich. It's an Egyptian style decoration. It's a collared necklace motif. And I would suggest this too is a crescent lunate motif.
Hello, David. I'm sorry to interrupt. Some people are wondering if maybe you could speak just a bit louder.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
All right. So this crescent motif appears in several other places. For example, at Tel Dan, where I work. This is stuff that was published by my colleague Rachel Bendov. Earrings, pendants made of silver in this case, another shiny metal. Note that the shiny is an important thing to emphasize. Here's another grouping of metal objects from a silver hoard from a nearby site called Abel Beit Macha in the far north of Israel, just next to the Lebanese border. Here's another one of those crescents, which must have been mounted somehow with some kind of metal or cloth, perhaps as a necklace. And you'll see why I say that in a minute or two. Here's another hoard with crescent earrings and pendants from a place called Eshtamoa in the hill country of Judea, a little bit later, 10th century BC. And here's another one from about the same period from Tel Megiddo. Notice these lunate or crescent earrings that were part of the hoard in very good shape, excavated by Tel Aviv University not too long ago. And it's not just Israel or the southern Levant that we're talking about. These kinds of motifs are common throughout the ancient Near East. I'll give you just a couple examples from Sumer, from what is now Iraq. Here, for example, are some earrings from Queen, oh, I spelled that wrong, Queen Puabi's tomb in in the far south of Iraq. Again, the lunate motif. And here are some Sumerian hoop earrings, which are actually stylized crescents, if you will. Let's look at some of these now in stone. Here we have the famous Area C temple at Hatzor from the early part of the late Bronze Age. If we look closer at that, here is the central standing stone. Note that we have two hands referencing what looks like a crescent moon and a full moon in the center right there. And there's something else here that might be the mounting part of a pendant or something. Next to those standing stones was a statue, a figure of what is apparently a deity. The deity had had its head lopped off. You can see the crack right there. And the deity also had a necklace that has the inverse crescent moon and the full moon beneath it right there. Usually when you have a person like this seated, it's either a king or the chief deity. Yigal Yadin thought that this was the moon god Sin. And he thought the same about this figure. I couldn't find a good picture of it, but here's a drawing where you can see in this case a god who was originally standing on an animal, probably a bull, and there are the feet. And here's the rest of the figure. This had also been banged up and broken up on purpose. There, once again, we have the pendant with the crescent moon and the full moon beneath it. And clearly it's a pendant, identifying the god that this is, probably the moon god. Yigal Yadin thought it was the Mesopotamian god Sin. A little bit later in time, towards the end of the late Bronze Age, about 1300, 1200 BC, this is a standing stone, a carved stone that was found in Jordan, in a place called Balua, Tel Balua, south of Amman. If we make it a little bit bigger, what you can see here is three figures. In the center, it looks like there's a human figure who's paying obeisance to what looks like a sort of an Egyptianized god holding an Egyptian wasp scepter. And behind this person is what looks like a Canaanite goddess, according to the headdress. And this king, perhaps, if that's who he is paying obeisance to an Egyptian god, if the interpretation is correct. And note what is right at the shoulder of this king. See the crescent. And here on the other side is the crescent with the full moon in the middle. And these are sort of placed where you would expect to find earrings also. If we keep moving forward in time, here we have the site of Beit Saida, which is located just north of the Sea of Galilee, excavated by Rami Arav. And here you have this magnificent stela, standing stone at the top of an altar, which has a very clear bull-shaped figuring, but it's also anthropomorphized. And behind the back is a sword. So this is the lunar god in the shape of a bull, note the big horns, but also anthropomorphized, showing this, this tool or this weapon of power at Tel Beit Saida. Most scholars think this is the Aramean chief god Hadad, who was a moon god and a weather god, perhaps, and very common throughout the Aramean world. Here are a couple examples. Here are some examples from northern Syria, very much the same genre as the standing stone mounted on the altar at Tel Beit Saida. And if we look further afield in the ancient Near East, we have earlier similar scenes where the crescent is prominent. This is the very famous stela of Ur-Nammu, which is quite a bit earlier. The crescent moon is very much emphasized here. That might be the sun, between the crescent's horns. Perhaps it's the full moon, hard to say. In any case, astral images. There is an altar that was found in a Middle Assyrian temple to Ishtar, the fertility goddess, also a very powerful goddess. But part of that altar has also the moon god's emblems right here, just like the ones we saw at Hatzor, this time mounted on staffs. And there's quite a few of these, and this is a very common motif for hundreds and even thousands of years afterwards in Mesopotamia, this mounted staff showing the moon god and his symbol, the crescent moon. In this case, from Tel Achmar, you can see the moon god himself with the identifying horns above him. Here's another one from the Aramean site, by King Bar Raka from Syria. And note, once again, the same kind of staff-mounted motif. Another one from a site very near Haran in what is today Eastern Turkey. Haran, by the way, was the center of the moon god. He's called Sin of Haran. By the way, you might remember that somebody very important in the Hebrew Bible passed through Haran, namely Abraham. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Now let's look just briefly at another aspect of the moon god. Here's the site of Jericho. Jericho in Hebrew is Yericho, which shares the name with the moon, Yareach. This is the site of the moon god, Yarich or Yerich. There's another site right next to the Sea of Galilee, which is called Tel Beit Yerach, the house of the moon. This also apparently was an ancient site, which goes way back to the early Bronze Age, that was also dedicated to the moon god in Israel. Briefly, there are other things that exhibit the moon god's motifs, glyptics, cylinder seals and stamp seals. Here's one that's in the British Museum. It's an impression of a cylinder seal of a priest whose name is Hashamer Patesi, which means high priest, of the god Sin at Ishkun Sin. This is from Sumeria also. Dates way back to the year 2400. And here's something much, much later, a Sassanid stamp seal impression showing once again that staff with the crescent moon. And in this case, there's a star up above it. Whether or not it was originally intended to be a star, that's another question. But these things are quite common. Here's another one of the same school, in this case showing two figures dancing with the moon crescent above, perhaps a ritual scene. What do texts have to say about the moon and its worship? From the Library of Ugarit, which is a late Bronze Age site on the Syrian coast of the Mediterranean, at this site were found about 1,500 documents in various forms of completeness. Many of them are poetry. 50 of them are very important epic poems. One of them is the Baal cycle, which you can see here to the right. The one that I want to reference is a poem called Nikal and the Kathirat, which is a poem about how the moon, the luminary of heaven, sends to Herchebi, the summer's king, another god, give Nikal, the moon, will pay the bride price. Let the fruitful one enter his house, and I will give her bride price to her father. 1,000 pieces of silver, yea, 10,000 of gold. I will send gems of lapis lazuli. I will make her fallow field into a vineyard, the fallow fields of her love into orchards. Nikal is the goddess of the orchards, and this is probably something that was sung, or at least proclaimed during the fruit tree harvest period at the end of summer or the beginning of fall. And she is betrothed to the moon god. And this is sort of a portrayal of how the moon god courts her and asks to pay the dowry, which is a very expensive, very shiny, silvery gold kind of dowry, to her father, who is the king of summer. So a very important sort of reference to the moon god and his role in fertility and in ceremonial activity. The moon is also referenced in funerary ceremonies. This example from texts at Mari, and this is just one of many, many such texts, the Kispum ceremony, where at the new moon and full moon, you place offerings to the dead, bread, water, perhaps other things. And the god who is referenced in these post-mortem ceremonies is Sin. Sin release them, that is the ghosts of the ancestors, to eat their bread and drink their water. This is sustenance for the dead that the living are having to leave to their ancient ancestors. And here's an example of offerings in a tomb in Syria, at a place called Katna, in a royal tomb that is underneath the palace of Katna. Even the Hebrew Bible, of course, references the moon in somewhat different terminology, but Psalm 81, for example, is a song that was sung during a festival where you blow the trumpet in the new moon and during the time of the full moon, and during a solemn feast day. As one of the, probably originally one of the agricultural and historical celebratory festivals. And if we briefly hop over to the classical world, one of the hymns attributed to Homer, although it's not 100% sure, is a hymn to Selene, who is the moon goddess. And this is quite beautiful, actually. The air, unlit before, glows with the light of her golden crown, and her rays being clear, whensoever bright Selene, having bathed her lovely body in the waters of ocean, and donned her far gleaming raiment, and yoked her strong necked shining team, drives on her long maned horses at full speed. So another hymn to the moon goddess, obviously an important feature for all kinds of different reasons, providing light, fertility, and so on. Okay, so now let's try to figure out what all of this means, especially as far as jewelry is concerned. And I've shown you these things in the previous slides because part of the point is that you can't just look at jewelry, for example, and arrive at a conclusion without looking at other aspects of material culture and high culture, text. All these things need to inform each other in order to arrive at some kind of archaeological interpretation. So what is this object? What does it mean? Why is it important? Why are all of these things so shiny and so ever present in the material culture at Tel Dan and all these other Bronze Age and Iron Age sites? What is their role? Well, first of all, what's the role of jewelry? It has lots of different functions in society. It can be a display of status and wealth. I mean, here are some very famous people showing very famous jewelry, and it's obviously sending a message to the public about status and wealth. So that's one possibility. It can also be used to emphasize sexuality. It's more common today than it was in the antiquity. Jewelry can also be a symbol of commitment. Usually in our society, it's more the men that have to display this symbol of commitment by giving jewelry, but it's something that occurs in many different societies in antiquity as well. It can also be something that displays group identity and belonging or ideology, as these kinds of emblems show. And people that walk around today with a Jewish star or with a cross or with a Buddhist element or something are saying something about themselves and who they identify with. And it can also be something that's apopatraic or protection against the forces of evil. That's also something you find in many different cultures. And it can just be something that is a sort of meditative device, prayer beads, worry beads in Islamic culture. That's another possibility. So what are these things? What is their role? If we take consideration of all the previous possibilities. Well, wealth and status. Does that fit? To some degree. Anybody that has gold or silver or even copper is in possession of wealth. And by showing people what you have as far as wealth is concerned, you're telling them where you stand status-wise. So that can certainly be an option. In antiquity, emphasis of sexuality, so far I can find no evidence of that whatsoever, so probably not. A sign of commitment, yes, but more to a god and to belief rather than a mate per se, although it's hard to say for sure. Group identity, certainly in the collective subconscious. I mean, if people are walking around with crescent earrings, you automatically know that those are your co-religionists or brethren, and that has a function in society. I would say that the most important function of jewelry, and that those shiny crescent motifs, is probably to gain protection and comfort from the deity. And if the moon god is the most prominent on display here with jewelry, probably the moon god had a very important role to play in this society in the southern Levant, in ancient Israel and before, and even after. So this object is a crescent, and I've gone into all this bit about the crescent and the moon god and his protective abilities and importance for people. But as an appendix here, I have to tell you that actually this piece is not a pendant. When I consulted with my colleague Baruch Brandel at the Israel Antiquities Authority, he pointed out to me that this actually looks like it may have been part of a Middle Bronze Age belt. It's part of the buckling of the Middle Bronze Age belt. It's not a pendant, it's not an earring, it doesn't have the right profile. So in essence, this whole research that I did ended up being something that wasn't really relevant to this particular object. Not that I'm sorry I went into it, because I gained all kinds of understandings, but I just have to tell you that this is just probably part of a Middle Bronze Age, circa 1600 BCE belt buckle. But as long as we're at it, let's look at just a brief addendum regarding the lunar crescent and Islam. Remember that before I showed you some glyptics, some seals of the Sassanid Empire, which is a much later empire. This is the empire that had its headquarters in Persia, just before Islam conquered the Middle East. This was still a polytheistic culture with many different gods, where the moon god was still a very important god. And I showed you some of the seals before. Here's also a coin where you can see up there the crescent and the staff. So way up into the Common Era, there is the crescent in both these cases. So the moon god persists for thousands of years in the ancient Near East. The Sassanid Empire had a big competitor in the Byzantine Empire to the west, and they came into major conflict in the 7th century, circa 658 CE. The Byzantines won that epic battle, and they defeated the Sassanid Empire, and very soon thereafter the Sassanid Empire collapsed. To commemorate the victory over the Sassanid Empire, the Byzantine Empire minted coins and adopted the symbols of the Sassanid Empire, showing the crescent moon and the star above it as a symbol of their victory. Hundreds of years after that, the Byzantine Empire was forced to confront the Ottoman Turks, and the Ottoman Turks defeated the Byzantines and took their capital at Constantinople in the 13th century. And to commemorate their victory over the Byzantines, they adopted the symbol of victory that the Byzantines had adopted before them. They adopted the crescent. And that became eventually the flag of modern Turkey. And also the Ottomans carried out a command. They published a command that all of the mosques in the Ottoman Empire would have the crescent adorning the minaret. And this became the symbol of Islam because of this. And that symbol was adopted by many Islamic countries as a symbol of their allegiance to Islam, and it comes from the Ottoman motif that was adopted as a symbol of victory over the Byzantines. So we started with the Venus of Lucelle, and we ended here with the croissant. But there's a story here too, because the croissant actually may be a symbol that continues this whole motif. You may recall that the Ottoman Empire laid siege to Vienna in the 17th century. And the Viennese were victorious in the end. They rebuffed the Ottoman army, which had to withdraw. And to celebrate the victory, at least this is how one of the stories goes, the Viennese bakeries started making this pastry. And in the 19th century, a veteran Viennese artilleryman immigrated to Paris and opened up a bakery. I think it was in 1838. And this bakery was called Les Viennoises. And these cakes, or these breads, are still called le pain viennois, otherwise known as the croissant. And I think our story ends right here today. Thank you very much. Now we can take questions. Okay. So right now I have a question. Feel free to ask more if you like, and maybe Joy can repeat some if I'm missing them. One question is, can he reiterate the connection? It sounds like it was for the moon god, and then in conquering the Byzantines, they took the symbol, which then became a symbol of Islam, even though Islam arguably does not worship a moon god. Exactly, that's what happened. Islam was aniconic. You're not supposed to show any kind of symbol or portrayal of Allah or Muhammad at all. And so it originally was a symbol of a deity. The Byzantines took it over. They took it over not as a symbol of their deity. They took it more over as a symbol of their victory over the Sassanid Empire. And when Islam, in the guise of the Ottoman Empire, defeated the Byzantine Empire, it just adopted the symbol in a similar way, but they looked at the astral symbol of the moon and the stars as part of Allah's greatness and his creation of the world. Doug Sparks asks, was the crescent ever adopted by early Judaism? And the answer is no, not as far as we know. The moon is present in early Israelite religion. Probably early Israelites were wearing earrings like the ones I showed you before. And you have to remember that early Israelite religion was not monotheistic. Monotheism takes hold more in the exilic period in exile, so that the moon god may have been present even in early Israel, although Yahweh was the chief god. So no. And of course, in Judaism per se, in Second Temple period Judaism, it was also, for the most part, aniconic. So you're not going to see symbols of deity really in any way or form, although sometimes here and there, inside the walls of people's houses, wealthy people's houses, you did see a few sort of portrayals of human and animal images, but for the most part, you're not going to see something which is takes the form of deity, because that was anathema. Amanda asks another question. Would you consider Yahweh and or Baal also to be a lunar deity, as they are also related to the bull icon and potentially associated with the fertility goddess, that is Asherah? And I would say this, what the biblical text does in Genesis is it takes all of the gods of nature, the sky, the earth, the heavens, the sea, death. It takes all of these early Canaanite Semitic gods, and it basically says in the creation epic, all of these things were created by Yahweh. So all of the elements that were brought into under the cloth of Yahweh are subsidiary to Yahweh. Initially, the other gods were not excluded, they were accepted, but Yahweh created all of them too, which of course made his place in the pantheon paramount. So in that way, God created the lunar deity, created the moon. So those kinds of items and icons could be associated with Yahweh also. I'll just say that most scholars that work on the iconography of Yahweh see Yahweh as a solar god. First and foremost, we see the solar disk in the Lamelech seals and in the imagery in the biblical text. And for that, I would point you to Tali Ornan's work, for example. Yahweh is more a solar deity.
David, we have another question.
Yes.
Why was the crescent shown facing up at the earliest times when there is no moon phase in which the crescent faces up?
I think for the most part, well, that's a good question, but I don't know about the Losel relief. I can't speak to that. It might be that it has more to do with the horn than the moon itself. The idea of how the crescent is positioned, I'm not sure how important it is, because the crescent also doesn't, the moon also doesn't point down, and you have that on the pendants when it's clearly a moon crescent. So usually you would see it off to the side, right? You wouldn't see it down, you wouldn't see it up. So I'm not sure how critical it is exactly how it's portrayed. Somebody asks, does Australia's boomerang fit the crescent motif? I have no idea. Interesting idea. You would have to consult someone who deals with Australian or Aborigine iconography, but it's an interesting question. Here's another question. Why is the moon so prevalent over, say, the sun god, Shemesh, Shama, Shapsu? Is there a parallel narrative? This was asked by Professor Aaron Burke from UCLA. I'm not sure, and I think in Mesopotamia, it depends on the time period and the place you're talking about. In some places, Shamash, the sun god, is much more important, or Marduk in the Babylonian period, and the moon god won't be as important. There is jewelry, for example, in the shape of the sun. So it may be that in some places, the sun god is preeminent, and the moon god is of lesser importance. But where the moon god is the god of the city or of the kingdom, for example, in Haran, or in the other parts of Ugarit, for example, you're going to see the moon god more present. And it is interesting that in Canaan, you do see the lunar motif much more frequently than you do see the sun. And that's something that I think maybe needs a little bit more research as to why that would be. Matt Young asks, I thought the ivories and maybe some others near the beginning looked more like horns. They were not symmetrical. Comment? I think that you know, if you have a natural substance, a horn, it's not going to be completely symmetrical necessarily. It is pretty symmetrical though. At the same time, they look very similar to that bright white crescent moon. That's as much as I could say about it. I don't know. Henry Rassoff asks, says, thank you. Obviously, many crescents are clearly crescent moon representations, but is it possible that some of the crescents are just crescents with no symbolism? Also, is it possible to read in more than actually is there? For example, if I look around me, I probably can see a lot of crescent shapes that result from the way my mind works. Thank you. That's an interesting question. In ancient times, up until, let's say, the Renaissance, or maybe, say, Giotto, there's not really such thing as art for art's sake. And if there is an intentional portrayal of an image, it has meaning, and there's some kind of symbolism being invoked. Now, clearly, some things are going to be just stuff that we see, and then we're making more out of it that needs to be made of it. But if somebody's going to the trouble to carve out a crescent of ivory or make holes in it, it's a very valuable substance. If they're making something out of gold and silver, it's very valuable. It's not just for aesthetic purposes. There's another point to make here, and I'm glad you asked the question. When you look at the jewelry of the ancient Near East and even of Egypt, it's very redundant. The same motifs occur over and over again. This tells us this doesn't have the originality of modern jewelry. When you look at modern jewelry, it's very creative. You don't see very much in the way of redundant motifs, except maybe hoop earrings. But everybody's trying to express themselves. In antiquity, the same motifs occur over and over again, and that tells us that it's not about art. It's not about individual expression. It's about the jewelry doing something. It might be beautiful, but it invokes something. And I have suggested that it invokes protection. So that would be my take on that. Sid Fox asks, upward facing because it holds water. I don't quite see how that would work. Could you repeat the Tali reference, Sid asks. I'm talking about Professor Talai Ornan of the Hebrew University, who has written extensively about ancient Near Eastern iconography, and especially about Yahweh being a solar deity. Henry asks again, some Indian women, Indian, wear a nose ornament that is an upside down crescent. Whether these have anything to do with the moon, I do not know. What do you think? I would have to check that. Hindu religion is a polytheistic religion. There's probably a moon god in there somewhere. I'm sure there is. Somebody online probably can answer that question. So I wouldn't be surprised. Nadia Ben Marzouk asks, do you see a connection between metal or certain metals and the moon? You emphasize the shiny aspect. I may have missed it if you expanded on a potential connection. Definitely, the whole point here is that all this jewelry is made of shiny metals. It's either gold, silver, or copper. All of those can be made to be very, very shiny, and the shininess invokes the god and is part of the protective aspect of the talisman jewelry. Yes. Okay, any other questions? I hope I didn't skip anybody, but I think that's it.
I think you got them all, David. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, the delightful glimpse into your process, and your thoughtful responses to all of our questions. And I want to thank the rest of you all for joining us here today. Hopefully, you'll join us again next week for our Exceptional Women Speaker Series with Ursula Minizinski on March 31st. And then David Ilan will be joining us again the following week on April 5th. We're so happy to have you back. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to both of these upcoming presentations. Please let us know if any of you have questions, concerns, or ideas for more virtual programs. I look forward to hearing from you and to staying connected as best we can. Thank you again, David. Everyone
Thank
stay
you.
healthy and safe. Have
All
a
right. Bye
wonderful
now.
day. Bye.